Ableton Live was created by three software developers named Gerhard Behles, Robert Henke, and Bernd Roggendorf in the mid-90s. Little did any of them know, Ableton would go on to become one of the most competitive and dominant pieces of music software in the entire world. Behles and Henke met at the Technical University of Berlin, where they wrote code in the music programming language called Max so they could perform techno music. They were deep into the electronic music scene in Berlin and realized there was a hole in the marketplace, a need for music production software that was easy to use and doubled as a live performance tool. Years later, Henke recalled their feelings on the matter during the development process of Ableton Live, saying, "I think the feeling we had was that there was enough like-minded people in our closer community who could appreciate a product like this and that it could work commercially. That gave us confidence to believe that a small company could actually survive in the market." One of the first signs that the trio saw pointing to the possibility of this product being a global phenomenon was when they were at a trade show illustrating the ability of Ableton Live to producers, engineers, composers, and the like. A German man came up to them who they later realized to be Hans Zimmer, one of the most legendary Hollywood composers to ever write music for movies. He was so impressed by the program's ability to change the tempo of loops without altering the pitch that he asked if the trio had a card and told them, "You guys have something really interesting here." This was the turning point for Ableton Live, and it became the jumping off point for Ableton to change the music production scene forever. It wouldn't be until years later though that Ableton would get its first commercial version. On October 30th, 2001, Ableton Live would receive its first commercial release. The fact that Ableton was created by people who produced music themselves and were connected to the EDM scene played a major role in Ableton's success. They were able to get their product directly in front of professional producers in Berlin who had rising careers. One of the reasons why Ableton became so widely used in such a short amount of time was because the program was not just a DAW for music production. It was an all-in-one music suite that functioned off of loops, which catered to EDM producers that did live shows. Hence why the program is called Ableton Live. Unlike many other music production software at the time, Ableton did not use multi-track recording. Instead, the entire program was designed around triggering loops. It had tools that allowed DJs and producers doing live shows to play samples and time-stretched loops live. This was very appealing to somebody doing a live show because they had control over the mixing and beat matching, which resulted in a very smooth transition between different songs or even meshing two or more songs together. At this time though, Ableton was still in its early stages and was most certainly not a full DAW. It had humble beginnings as a loop arrangement tool, much like other software that existed at the time. It was never actually intended to become a music production suite. It was originally geared entirely toward live performances. This gave Ableton a leg up on other products because it was unique in that regard. Having the endorsement of big-name DJs and producers doing live shows was a massive benefit. Legendary names in the industry like deadmau5, Armin van Buuren, and Plastic Man all utilized Ableton during their live shows and still do to this day. Ableton's session view was the golden goose for the software because it allowed DJs to view their projects in a grid view where they could assign specific samples or loops to a square on the grid to trigger it. It was sort of like a digital launchpad before launchpads were a thing. The opposite of the session view was the arrange view that was still accessible in the early versions of Ableton. It was the more traditional horizontal view for arranging your projects, much like other DAWs. At this point though, Ableton offered no MIDI sequencing features at all, which was much different from many of its peers. Ableton focused entirely on loop and sample manipulation, which at the time was actually a benefit because it was easy to use and the workflow was perfect for live performances and the loop-heavy nature of EDM. Ableton was also one of the first programs to offer real-time audio stretching that wasn't complete and total garbage. At the time, and still somewhat to this day, real-time audio stretching has been a problem because most algorithms can only stretch a sample out so far until it starts losing quality and tone, but not Ableton's. Their implementation of this was so good and is still, in my opinion, the best audio stretching any DAW has ever had. Things were looking good for Ableton, and the best was certainly yet to come. Only a year had passed and Ableton got its first big version update on December 22nd, 2002. Rather than jumping in to make Ableton a full-blown DAW, instead they continued focus on the live aspect of the program, upgrading both the arranger and session views. In the arranger view, you could now record unlimited takes of any audio on an unlimited number of tracks. Theoretically, it was unlimited, but remember, we are in the early 2000s, and computers haven't even begun to reach the insane speed and power they would in the coming decades, so you were still somewhat held back by the power of computers of the time. Time stretching of samples now worked on any type of audio material, and the algorithm was upgraded to lose even less quality when making extreme adjustments to clips. To add even more fuel to the tank for live performances, you can change the tempo of your project while it's playing by tapping or manually in the program to seamlessly switch between genres or transition between songs in a creative way. The mixer also had beautiful crossfading to complement these transitions, allowing DJs to easily decide how much of any given audio signal they want to send to the master output at any time. Switching over to the arrange view, you can now save effect presets for any track. This falls in line with other similar programs at the time, as the early 2000s, many of the features we take for granted now were still being developed for the first time or being refined. New modes were added to the famous auto filter plugin, which in my opinion is the cleanest version of a simple filter that any DAW has to offer. Basic things such as mono stereo buttons, solo buttons, and gain faders were still being added to the mixer at this time as well. There was also a full screen mode to take advantage of as much screen real estate as possible. As a producer, you'll know that having much more room to work with feels a lot better when arranging because you'll often have many windows open at once, and feeling cramped can hamper your workflow. Ableton 1, 2, and 3 used the Aqua design scheme for their logo that Steve Jobs popularized on macOS, QuickTime, and later the early versions of iOS. Ableton was doing well within the DJ space, but large software companies and competitors at the time didn't take Ableton seriously because of how ugly people perceived the interface to be, and the fact that having a laptop on stage during a performance was most certainly not common in the early 2000s. Little did they know though, Ableton would go on to be one of the most successful music software companies in the entire world and change the music industry forever. Ableton would continue their yearly release schedule for new versions, with Ableton 3 coming out on October 10th, 2003. If you haven't noticed yet, pretty much every version of Ableton has used the same exact user interface. This includes the most recent version, Ableton 11. Rather than making sweeping visual changes and moving things around, Ableton was focused on making the back end of their program the best of the best, and above all, making live performances easier and better. Personally, I was not the biggest fan of how this program looked. To be honest, I thought it was pretty f***ing ugly. But after seeing it more and more, it did grow on me. I think the Ableton workflow differentiates itself heavily from other DAWs and might be a bit difficult to switch to if you've been using a DAW that uses a pattern and playlist workflow. However, after using Ableton here and there, I can confidently say that the way Ableton lays itself out to the performer or producer results in a great experience using the software. Some other additions to Ableton 3 included being able to edit automation on any track while your project is looping, similar to how editing an LFO tool works. Something else that I desperately wish FL Studio had is Ableton's drag to replace feature. It's a pretty basic sounding feature, but oh my goodness does it feel good. Essentially, if you have automation or effects on a specific clip and you want to replace that clip with something else, you can drag the new clip or sample onto the old one, and all of your automation and FX will be superimposed on your new clip, and the old clip will be replaced entirely. In most other DAWs, dragging a new clip or sample on top of the current one will normally just layer it on top, requiring you to take the extra step of deleting the old one and redoing any automation you had set up. None of those things, though, would come close to what was coming in Ableton 4. Version 4 was released on July 28, 2004, keeping up with their near yearly release schedule for major versions of Ableton. MIDI sequencing finally arrived in this version, which was the turning point from which Ableton established itself as a fully functional DAW and became competitive with its peers. You could finally work with VSTs and use MIDI keyboards to create melodies, chords, or percussion patterns. This is what producers think of when they're thinking about a modern DAW. Ableton came flush with its own stock sounds and VSTs such as Impulse and Simpler. These were Ableton's version of a stock drum machine and melodic synthesizer. At this point, I'd consider Ableton to be a unique take on digital music production and was capable of really creating professional electronic music. Something I haven't yet talked about though is the effect chain workflow. To me, it was very weird coming from DAWs that use mixers and routing to apply effects and automation to instruments and samples. However, after getting used to it, I can confidently say this workflow is probably one of my favorites out there. Instead of effects being applied to a specific instrument, they're instead applied to a track on the playlist, and that one sample or instrument entirely consumes that track. This is the same for automation. It lives on the track it affects and can't be moved, which can be a good or bad thing depending on how you like your workflow to be. This type of interface is a lot more beginner friendly, and I think it is intuitive to someone who hasn't ever touched a DAW before. Instead of having a giant mixer with digital routing and effects on each insert, you can just select a track and drag an effect to the bottom portion of the screen where your effect chain lives for that track. Now, all of this is actually a farce, because this is how the arrange view shows you what's going on. But in reality, if you go back to the session view, which is what most live performances are using, it does look like a more traditional mixer. However, the effects and automation are still track-bound rather than being attached to a specific sample or VST. On the topic of the session view and live performances, Ableton 4 offered a new feature called follow actions, which essentially boils down to allowing performers to predetermine what sounds and samples they want to play at what time. This is how a lot of DJs will create their sets, by creating a group of follow actions and then using that during their live performance, so Ableton handles most of the timing automatically, which leads to less human error. This is one thing that I'll always be fond of. Even though I'm not a live performer, it is respectable that Ableton has never forgotten about its roots as a tool for DJs and constantly offers new features and upgrades to both the bedroom producer and the big-time DJ. After version 4, Ableton would continue to build upon its feature list and stock plugin repertoire, much like other DAWs at the time. Version 5 released on July 24, 2005, almost exactly 1 year after version 4. It would add MP3 file support for the first time. This was a big deal because in the early and mid-2000s, everyone with a laptop and iTunes had hundreds, if not thousands, of songs on their computer that could now be tinkered with in Ableton. Whether it be bootleg remixes or just a guy wanting to hear what Backstreet Boys would sound like if they were chipmunks, you can now make that dream come true with Ableton. Ableton 5 was also the version which added probably the least understood and most talked about feature, complex warp mode. This was truly the gold standard for changing the pitch and timing of any sample or loop. I can't think of any algorithm in any DAW that does this better than Ableton, and it is still used to this day, albeit even better now. It was designed specifically to warp composite signals that contain many different tones and textures. It's also monstrously CPU intensive, using over 10 times the amount of power of any other warping algorithm. At this time, Ableton was fully capable and ready to take on the world of music production. Some of the most popular DJs and producers were using Ableton at this time. People like deadmau5, Skrillex, Nero, and Bassnectar were all fans of the software. One of Skrillex's more recent songs was accompanied by a video of the song being played inside Ableton Live. Version 6 came out September 29, 2006, and offered a host of new instruments like electric keyboards, a harp, classic guitars, or even orchestral sounds. You can now save effect chains by using the Effect Rack feature. Much like many other DAWs, Ableton finally had its classic stock EQ plugin called EQ8, which is still used to this day. Things were looking great for Ableton. From here on out, there weren't any huge changes made to the look or feel of the software. Instead, most of the updates would be plugin based or making the program faster and smoother to use. Things like the instrument VSTs Tension, Electric, and Analog were released with Ableton 7 on November 29, 2007. It also included a 64-bit mode for most of its stock plugins and underlying engine. Ableton 7 was actually ahead of the curve when it came to a few things as well, including time signature changing, which was a feature added to most DAWs much later. Ableton 7 is also the version that looks most like what people use today in Ableton 11. They'd found their style and stuck with it. 2 years later, on April 2, 2009, version 8 was released. This was more of the same from 7, featuring a host of bug fixes and performance enhancements. Most notably, a lot of the effect VSTs were added as stock plugins such as a vocoder and frequency shifter. A vocoder is similar to a talkbox like Daft Punk uses, except digital. A frequency shifter is exactly what it sounds like. It takes the original signal and bends the frequency of it. Nothing too crazy happened for the next couple of years. Curiously, you were still able to buy a physical copy of Ableton at this point. After the late 2000s, most programs had opted to discontinue this because it wasn't cost efficient and created waste. However, I do actually like owning physical copies of things because these days everything is digital or subscription based. In version 9, the most expansive upgrade to the stock sounds came along with over 3,000 different stock sounds to use in the suite version of Ableton 9. You could also extract MIDI from audio files. This is notoriously hard for computers to do, especially if there are stacked layers in an audio file, but Ableton's take on it was top-notch. I think one of the most important updates came with the addition of the glue compressor. This was created with a partnership from Cytomic that recreated the classic 1980s glue compressor digitally. It is one of the best plugins ever for mastering and mixing, and as the name suggests, it attempts to glue your mix together so all of your sounds mesh nicely. Lastly, Ableton 9 introduced their first hardware product, Push. This was a hardware instrument created to control nearly any digital button or knob inside Ableton. It also doubled as a launchpad with direct Ableton compatibility. Upon release, Push had generally favorable reviews from people within the music industry, although the price tag was pretty hefty, coming in at $5.99. Things were quiet for a while after that. That is, until February 6, 2018, when Ableton 10 was released. By this time, Ableton had been releasing videos on YouTube much like ImageLine did for FL Studio, showcasing new features from the software. Ableton 10 and 11 were similar in the types of updates they received. We received Wavetable, a synthesizer that comes stock with Ableton and is a dual oscillator wavetable synthesizer, much like Serum or Vital. Echo also came with version 10, which was a versatile delay effect plugin that offered analog emulated delay or a more modern digitized delay sound. These versions of Ableton would be the gold standard. Looking through the patch notes for these versions, it's clear that the developers of this program cared deeply about not only its success, but the people using it. So many things were fixed, upgraded, and added, it would take hours to go through an exhaustive list. One of my good friends who is a producer that uses Ableton started when he was just 14 and was in love ever since. Even though I don't use Ableton frequently, I fully appreciate its impact on the music industry and the producers that use it, and I think it will go on to be one of the most fondly remembered pieces of software. I hope these types of videos not only give you a little glimpse into the history of these programs and people, but help you appreciate the hard work, effort, and above all, fucking awesome music that gets created with them. Thank you guys for watching, stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next video.